Hey there! Have you ever had one of those moments where you're so incredibly brassed off with the authorities that you briefly wonder what would happen if the local town hall just vanished? We've all had that fleeting, dark thought after receiving a particularly offensive tax bill. But back in the autumn of 1605, a few wealthy Midlands lads took that exact thought and actually ran with it, right to the absolute edge of sanity. They weren't grand, spotless figures out of a history textbook. They were just exhausted, paranoid blokes who had run out of patience and gotten themselves thoroughly cornered by the law. Convincing themselves that God was on their side, they decided that instead of just complaining over a pint, they'd pack a dark cellar with enough raw explosives to turn the entire British ruling class into a cloud of flying splinters and soot. In this video, we will see how a small group of rebels nearly blew up the king. We will see the secret cellar right beneath the Parliament floor. We will see the 36 barrels of gunpowder stacked high and hidden under ordinary firewood, and the man caught red-handed in the dark, the man we call Guy Fawkes, though he preferred Guido. But before we get to the fuses and the treason, we have to look at the massive, awkward shift in power that started the whole mess. Because everything changed when a quite bizarre Scottish king packed his bags and headed south to take a throne he had been eyeing for decades. Elizabeth Tudor was finally dead. It took her long enough, 70 years, which was practically ancient for the 16th century, and her passing in the spring of 1603 felt less like a funeral and more like a collective exhalation across the entire island. She had no direct heir. The succession was a conversational minefield that could get your ears cropped, and the country was broke from fighting Spain. For the English Catholics, who had spent decades dodging the Queen's priest hunters, hiding in cramped holes built into chimneys, and paying ruinous fines just for skipping Sunday services at the local parish church, this was the moment they had been praying for. Enter James Stuart, the 6th of Scotland, now the 1st of England. His mother, after all, was Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic martyr par excellence who had lost her head on Elizabeth's chopping block. James himself had a Catholic wife, Anne of Denmark, though her religious leanings were a bit of a moving target depending on who she was talking to at the time. The new king was an odd fish, to put it mildly. He had these strangely thick tongues that made him clatter his speech. He hated the sight of a drawn sword, supposedly because of a trauma while still in his mother's womb. And he had a habit of wearing heavily quilted dagger-proof waistcoats because he was utterly paranoid about assassination. Yet he was highly intellectual, a bit of a pedant. He wrote books on witchcraft and tobacco, hating the latter with a passion that would make a modern health inspector proud. Before he even crossed the border, word had spread that James was planning a clean slate. He had dropped hints to Catholic noblemen that he wouldn't hunt them down, provided they kept their heads down and remained civilly obedient. The early months of his reign in 1603 felt different. The crushing pressure eased, if only a fraction. There was this sudden, bright burst of optimism among the old Catholic gentry. The Treshams, the Wrights, the Catesbys. These weren't peasants. These were wealthy, established families who owned large swathes of the Midlands. People who just wanted to hear Mass without the state treating them like foreign spies. They thought this Scottish king, with his notions of ecumenical peace and his dislike of religious extremism, would finally grant them some form of toleration. My uncle used to say that the worst thing you can give a desperate person is a tiny glimmer of hope, because when you snatch it back, the darkness feels twice as heavy. I suppose he was right. James arrived in a London that was currently being ripped apart by the plague. Not that anyone mentions that much, and he immediately found himself buried under a mountain of debt left behind by the late Queen. The state machinery was still run by the same people who had served Elizabeth, chiefly Robert Cecil, a man who was small in stature, but possessed an intellect like a steel trap and an information network that rivaled anything the modern world could dream up. Cecil wasn't about to let the old Catholic threat lift its head. Then, some idiot ruined it for everyone. A handful of secular priests and a rather unhinged Catholic nobleman decided to plot a ridiculous coup known as the Bye Plot, aiming to kidnap the king and force him to grant religious freedom. It was utterly botched from the start, and it was actually betrayed to the government by other, more mainstream Catholics who wanted to prove their loyalty to James. But the damage was done. The paranoid king, already terrified of sudden violence, realized that these papists weren't just a quiet minority wanting to pray in peace. They were, in his eyes, a potential knife in his back. By the time the winter of 1603 rolled around, the atmosphere had soured completely. James felt cheated by the lack of gratitude, while the Catholics felt cheated by the lack of reform. The promises made on the road from Edinburgh began to evaporate. The king gave a speech to Parliament where he made it quite clear that while he didn't want to purify the land with blood, he certainly wasn't going to tolerate an alternative allegiance to the Pope in Rome. It became increasingly obvious to anyone paying attention that the golden dawn everyone had imagined was actually just a brief pause before the storm restarted. A young gentleman named Robert Catesby was watching all of this. He was a man of extraordinary charisma, the sort of fellow who could convince you to jump off a cliff because he made the descent sound so thoroughly magnificent. He had already been involved in the Essex Rebellion a few years prior, which had cost him a massive fortune in fines, but he hadn't learned his lesson. He was brooding. The realization that James was not their saviour, but merely a more academic version of their old oppressor, began to harden into something quite dangerous. The optimism was dead. The finers were about to return with a vengeance, and Catesby was already looking around for something more substantial than mere protest. He was looking for gunpowder. The money. It always comes down to the money. In February 1604, King James, probably looking at his empty treasury and realizing that maintaining a royal household with a penchant for lavish masks and expensive hunting trips was going to cost an absolute fortune, decided to reverse his earlier leniency. He ordered that the recusancy fines, the financial penalties imposed on anyone who refused to attend the official Church of England services, be collected again, and not just collected going forward, but collected retroactively for the period he'd let them slide. It was ruinous. For a wealthy Catholic gentleman, it meant paying £20 a month, which back then was enough to buy a decent-sized house or at least a couple of very good horses. If you couldn't pay, the Crown could simply march onto your land and seize 2/3 of your property, leaving your family to basically starve in the remaining third. The poorer folk, who couldn't possibly find £20 if they lived to be 100, were fined a shilling for every Sunday they missed, a sum that stripped the bread right off their tables. Priests were ordered to leave the kingdom by a specific deadline, and anyone caught harbouring them was facing the gallows, the disemboweling knife, and the forequarters of their body being displayed on poles across the city. I don't know why, but James genuinely thought this would make his kingdom more stable. He seemed to think that if you squeezed people hard enough, they would simply conform out of exhaustion. But human nature doesn't really work that way, does it? The psychological toll must have been immense. You're sitting in your manor house, watching the king's commissioners drive your cattle off your land because you wouldn't take an oath that says the Pope is an antichrist. You've got children to feed. Your ancestors built this house, they fought for the old kings, and now you're a second-class citizen in your own country because of how you prefer to pray. The desperation wasn't just a political grievance anymore. It was personal. It was a slow, burning rage that lived in the pits of their stomachs. Robert Catesby was not the sort of man to sit quietly while his estate was dismantled by royal bean counters. He'd already lost a vast amount of money after the Essex business, as I mentioned, and his wife, Catherine, had died a few years earlier, which some people think left him with nothing much to lose, and a mind that was increasingly prone to dark, obsessive thoughts. He began to see the situation not as a temporary political setback that could be negotiated away through Parliament, but as an absolute war for the survival of the true faith. He was convinced that peaceful protest was a joke. The king had lied to them. Cecil was pulling the strings. The Parliament was preparing to pass even harsher laws in the coming session. There was this rumour, or maybe just a collective feeling among the desperate, that something massive had to be done to break the deadlock. A small, subtle protest wasn't going to cut it. You couldn't just throw a brick through a window or write a nasty pamphlet. It had to be a strike so total, so utterly devastating, that it would wipe out the entire oppressive apparatus in a single, terrifying second. Catesby started dropping hints to his cousin, Thomas Winter, a man who had travelled abroad, spoke several languages, and knew a thing or two about soldiering. Winter was initially hesitant, apparently. He thought the idea of a violent uprising was madness, and that they should still try to get foreign help from Spain, but Spain was currently trying to make peace with England, so that was a dead end. Catesby looked at Winter and basically said that he had an idea that would strike at the root of all their miseries. He didn't give the full details right away. He just let the idea hover in the air. He told Winter that they needed to deliver a blow that would destroy the king, the lords, the bishops all at once. He was talking about Parliament. He was talking about the state opening, when every single person who held power over their lives would be gathered in one single room. It was an insane concept. Nobody had ever tried to blow up a government before. You had assassinations, sure, a dagger in the dark or a bit of poison in a wine cup. But this was something entirely new. It was industrial-scale terrorism before the industry even existed. Winter was horrified, but also completely captivated by Catesby's sheer intensity. That's the thing about cultish leaders. They can make the apocalyptic sound reasonable. They were joined by John Wright, one of the best swordsmen in England, another man who had been chewed up by the Elizabethan state and had the scars to prove it. But they needed a specialist, someone who actually knew how to handle explosives, because none of these gentlemen had the slightest clue how to mix gunpowder without blowing their own fingers off. Thomas Winter had already been dispatched to Flanders to find such a man, and he had returned with a rather quiet, intense fellow he'd picked up in Ostend, a professional soldier who had been fighting for the Spanish king. His name was Guy Fawkes. They needed a proper headquarters, a place to look each other in the eye and swear the sort of oath you can't back out of without losing your soul. It happened on May 20th, 1604. The Strand was a chaotic mess of a street back then, packed with horses and people, and right in the middle of it stood an inn called the Duck and Drake. Catesby, Winter, and John Wright booked a private room upstairs. They brought in 2 more men to complete their core circle, Thomas Percy, a rather wild character from the great northern house of Northumberland, who had once been a bit of a bandit, but was now a fierce convert, and Guy Fawkes himself, operating under the alias John Johnson. 5 men in total. They sat around a table and Catesby finally laid out the mechanics of the nightmare he'd been dreaming up. He told them flat out they were going to blow up the House of Lords with gunpowder during the state opening of Parliament. I've always found it funny how people choose inns for secret plots. If I were planning to overthrow the government, the last place I'd go is a pub where the barmaid is probably a government informant, and the walls are about as thick as a piece of damp parchment. Humans never change. Anyway, Catesby didn't just want a verbal agreement. He wanted a blood-bound contract. They brought in a Jesuit priest named Father John Gerard, who was hiding out in London under a false name, though it seems pretty certain the poor priest didn't actually know what they were planning. He was just asked to perform a mass and administer the sacrament to these 5 gentlemen in another room. They swore a solemn oath on the Holy Trinity never to reveal what was discussed, to stay true to the cause, and to stick together until the end. The psychology here is fascinating because Percy was particularly furious. He had been the one James had allegedly promised toleration to back in Scotland, so he felt personally insulted. He kept shouting about wanting to kill the king himself, but Catesby calmed him down, explaining that a single assassination would change nothing because the Protestant structure would just appoint another heir. They needed to clean the slate. They needed to wipe out the king, his eldest son, Prince Henry, the bishops who enforced the fines, and the commons who wrote the laws. After the oath, they sat down to discuss the massive practical problems, starting with the fact that they were a small group of amateurs about to undertake a task that would require an immense, highly illegal amount of gunpowder without triggering every alarm bell in London. They needed to find a secure place to store it, and they needed to wait for the right moment to strike. Looking around that room at the Duck and Drake, they were a mix of desperate idealists and a cold professional soldier whose life was about to change forever. Guido Fawkes. He called himself Guido now, having spent about a decade fighting for the Catholic Spanish in the freezing, muddy trenches of Flanders. He was originally from York, a Protestant by birth actually, which is a bit of a weird detail that people usually skip over, but his father died when he was young, and his mother married a bloke who was a devout Catholic, and that seems to have turned his world entirely upside down. He sold off his small inheritance when he came of age, packed his bags, and headed off to the continent to become a mercenary. He wasn't a madman. By most accounts, he was a remarkably controlled, highly capable soldier, the sort of man who could look at a fortification and tell you exactly how many pounds of explosives you needed to turn the gatehouse into kindling. Winter liked him instantly. He wrote that Fawkes was a man of excellent good natural parts, pleasant of cheer, and incredibly loyal to his friends. It's always the quiet ones. You just never can tell with people who keep their mouths shut. Fawkes was exactly that type. He had this reddish-brown beard, a bit of a hooked nose, and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept properly since the late 90s. Once the oath was sworn at the Duck and Drake, Fawkes was fully initiated into the inner circle. To put their deadly plan into motion, they gave him a false identity, John Johnson, and his first job was to act as a servant to Thomas Percy. It was a brilliant bit of cover. Percy was a respectable gentleman, a relative of the Earl of Northumberland, so nobody blinked when he took a lease on this little property. Fawkes dressed up in a plain wool doublet, took the keys, and basically became the caretaker, sweeping the steps and locking the doors while keeping a sharp eye on the guards walking past outside. He had to spend his days pretending to be an ordinary, listening to the gossip of the Westminster neighbourhood. Catesby and the others stayed away from the house during daylight to avoid drawing suspicion. They left everything in the hands of this mercenary from Yorkshire, who sat alone in the small rooms waiting for the rest of the gang to make their move. They needed to get into the foundations. That house Percy rented, the one right next to the House of Lords, was supposed to be their launch pad, but things started getting incredibly messy almost immediately. The initial plan, or at least the one that historians kept repeating for centuries, though nobody is entirely sure if it actually happened this way, was to dig a massive tunnel right through the thick stone wall of the Parliament building itself. It sounds bloody exhausting. A bunch of wealthy gentlemen who had probably never held a shovel in their lives, stripped down to their shirts in a dark, damp basement, hacking away at ancient medieval masonry that had been baked hard as iron over the centuries. They supposedly brought in more muscle for this, John Wright's brother, Christopher, and Robert Keyes, a bloke who was apparently so broke he had to borrow money just to buy boots. They carried bags of earth out in the dead of night, dumping the dirt into the River Thames, or burying it under the gravel in the garden, while Fawkes stood watch at the street door. Anyway, the story goes that while they were sweating and groaning in the dark, they suddenly heard a strange scratching noise coming from right above their heads. They froze. Complete panic, obviously. They thought the King's Watchmen were tunnelling down to catch them red-handed with their shovels. Fawkes, being the only one with actual military nerves, slipped upstairs to find out what the hell was going on. It turned out to be a massive stroke of luck, or perhaps just a testament to how terribly organised the Palace of Westminster was back then. The noise was just a woman named Mrs. Ellen Bright, a coal merchant's widow who was clearing out her cellar. And that cellar wasn't just anywhere. It was an old, vaulted undercroft located directly beneath the literal chamber where the House of Lords sat. It was the perfect spot. The widow was giving up her lease because she didn't need the storage space anymore. Percy didn't waste a single second. He rushed off to find the landlord, a fellow named John Wynyard, who was the keeper of the King's Wardrobe, and offered him a ridiculous amount of money to take over the lease of that specific cellar. Wynyard, probably thinking Christmas had come early, agreed to the deal without asking any awkward questions. The tunnel idea was instantly abandoned. Why break your back digging through 10 feet of old stone when you can just walk right through the front door and rent the exact space you need? They moved in around March 1605. The undercroft was a huge, echoing vault with stone pillars, used mostly for storing firewood, old furniture, and barrels of beer. It was filthy dark, but to Catesby and his crew, it looked like the finest room in London. They had the venue. Now, they just needed to fill it with something that would make the history books remember their names forever. Immediately, they began the nerve-wracking work of moving their supplies. They had been using a house over in Lambeth on the South Bank as a temporary storage facility, managed by a fellow named Robert Keyes. Under the cover of night, Keyes rowed the heavy, creaking wooden barrels across the dark water of the Thames, where Fawkes waited on the Westminster side to haul them up the slimy stone steps and roll them into the undercroft. With the first batch of gunpowder safely stacked against the back wall, they needed backing. You can't just blow up a king and hope everyone goes home for tea. You need an army, or at least some foreign bloke with a chest full of gold doubloons to secure the borders while everything is on fire. Catesby sent Fawkes back across the English Channel in April 1605. He went to Flanders to see if he could drum up some support from the Spanish authorities, or the English exiles who were kicking about in Brussels. He was looking for Hugh Owen, a rather slippery Welsh Catholic spy who had been causing headaches for the English government for decades. The mission was a total flop. Spain was completely exhausted after decades of fighting Elizabeth, and their new king, Philip III, was desperately trying to sign a peace treaty with James to save his own bankrupt treasury. They weren't about to fund a bunch of random English gentlemen with an explosive hobby. Fawkes spent months walking those Flemish streets, talking to old military contacts in taverns, and getting nothing but shrugs and empty promises. Fawkes realised pretty quickly that they were completely on their own. No Spanish fleet was coming up the Thames. No foreign mercenaries were going to land in Kent to save the day. He came back to London in August, slipping through the ports using his John Johnson alias. Going straight back to the Westminster cellar, he found that the damp river air was already starting to ruin the powder, turning it into a useless, soggy paste. They had to secretly buy more to refresh the stock, eventually accumulating a staggering 36 barrels. Mind you, Fawkes knew his business. He covered the entire stack with hundreds of heavy iron bars, large logs and bundles of kindling wood called billets, partly to hide them from any casual visitor like the landlord or a surveyor, but also to act as a kind of shrapnel and tamping agent to ensure the blast went upward through the floorboards rather than outward into the garden. The powder was old, though. It was stuff that had probably been sitting in a merchant's warehouse since the Spanish Armada days, and because the undercroft was so damp, being right next to the river wall, the moisture was constantly threatening to ruin the mixture. Fawkes spent hours alone in that vault, lifting the canvas covers, checking the grain, and probably shifting the barrels around to make sure the bottom ones didn't spoil. Waiting for the date the king had set for the grand opening. If it had gone off, it wouldn't just have demolished the House of Lords, it would have shattered windows for miles around and levelled the old abbey. As the weeks dragged into autumn, Catesby realised their resources were running out. To fund the subsequent Midlands uprising once Parliament went sky-high, he expanded the gang, bringing in wealthy figures like Ambrose Rookwood in September, and finally Francis Tresham in October, men with deep pockets and fast horses. Meanwhile, Fawkes was left with the waiting. That's what ruins your nerves. The Parliament was originally supposed to meet early in 1605, but London was being hammered by another wave of the plague. King James packed up his court and fled into the countryside to go hunting, repeatedly postponing the opening ceremony first to October and then finally to the 5th of November. This meant Catesby and his crew had to sit on their hands for months while their mountain of gunpowder just sat there in the undercroft rotting away. Nerves were completely shredded. People were running out of money because keeping a secret terrorist cell afloat in London while paying rent on 2 properties is a seriously expensive business. The conspirators were getting incredibly jumpy. They were staying in different lodgings around London, meeting up in secret corners. Catesby had to keep bringing in more guys to fund the operation, including a wealthy young nobleman named Sir Everard Digby, who was so completely blinded by Catesby's charm that he promised to organise a massive fake hunting party in Warwickshire to gather a small army of Catholic horsemen the moment the news of the explosion reached the Midlands. They were planning a full-scale revolution, expecting to kidnap the king's young daughter, Princess Elizabeth, from her residence at Combe Abbey and place her on the throne as a puppet Catholic queen. But the longer the delay went on, the more people were brought into the loop, and if you know anything about humans, you know that keeping a secret between 3 people is hard enough. But trying to keep one between a dozen wealthy gentlemen with families and cousins sitting in the House of Lords is basically an statistical impossibility. In October, Francis Tresham, who had only recently been brought into the group because Catesby desperately needed his money, started getting incredibly anxious about his family connections. He had cousins sitting in the House of Lords. His brother-in-law was William Parker, Lord Monteagle, a Catholic peer who had managed to stay on the right side of the government despite his faith. Tresham couldn't bear the thought of his relatives being torn to pieces by the explosion. He allegedly begged Catesby to warn certain lords, or to call the whole thing off, but Catesby was completely unmovable. On the evening of October 26th, Monteagle was sitting down to supper at his house. A random messenger, wrapped in a dark cloak, handed Monteagle's footman a letter. The servant took it inside. Monteagle looked at the unaddressed, unsigned scrap of paper and, rather weirdly, handed it to one of his assistants named Thomas Ward to read aloud. It was an incredibly cryptic message. It warned Monteagle to find some excuse to stay away from the opening of Parliament, because they shall receive a terrible blow this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them. The conspirators met in a blind panic. They suspected Tresham instantly. Catesby and Winter hauled him to a tense confrontation in London, ready to run him through with their swords, but Tresham swore up and down on his life that he hadn't written it. He urged them to flee to France, telling them the plot was completely blown. Remarkably, Catesby decided to press on anyway. He sent Fawkes back down into the undercroft to check if the hidden barrels had been disturbed. Fawkes went down, found everything exactly as he'd left it, and reported back that the state had no idea. They chose to believe the letter was too vague to be taken seriously, or maybe they were just too deep into the madness to turn back. Monteagle didn't hesitate. He might have been a Catholic, but he was no fool, and he certainly didn't want to be blamed for knowing about a treasonous plot without saying anything. So he took that bizarre scrap of paper straight to Whitehall Palace that very night. He handed it over to Robert Cecil. Cecil was sitting down to dinner with several other powerful lords when the message arrived. He read it. He didn't scream for the guards. He didn't lock down the city. He just pocketed it, cool as you like, and decided to wait. Some people think he already knew about the plot through his vast network of spies and was just waiting for the perfect moment to catch everyone red-handed so he could maximise the political damage to the Catholic community. King James was away hunting in Cambridgeshire, chasing deer and avoiding his paperwork as usual. He didn't get back to London until the end of October. When they finally showed him the letter on the 2nd of November, the king's paranoid mind immediately latched onto that phrase about a terrible blow and the victims not seeing who hurts them. He thought it meant gunpowder. He remembered his own father, Lord Darnley, who had been blown sky high in his lodgings at Kirk Field back in Edinburgh when James was just a baby. It was his ultimate psychological nightmare. Speaking of royal paranoia, it's quite funny how James considered himself this great intellectual powerhouse, the Solomon of Christendom, as he liked to be called. But he was so terrified of everything that he wore those thick pants I told you about. Cecil let the king think he had solved the riddle all by himself. It was a masterpiece of courtly flattery. They decided not to search the buildings until the very last minute, the afternoon of the 4th of November, to let the plotters get fully into position. They sent the Chamberlain, Thomas Howard, the Earl of Suffolk, to do a rather casual walkthrough of the Westminster buildings, just to see what was what. He took a stroll down into the cellars, accompanied by Monteagle. They knocked on the door of the undercroft and Fawkes opened it, completely calm, still pretending to be John Johnson. Suffolk looked around, saw the massive mountain of firewood and asked Fawkes who owned all those logs. Fawkes told him they belonged to his master. Suffolk made a joke about Percy having an awfully large supply of winter fuel for a man who didn't spend much time in London. Then he just turned around and walked out. Fawkes must have breathed an absolute sigh of relief, thinking he had completely fooled the grandees of the realm. He was entirely alone now, and he'd been given his final orders by Catesby, who had already slipped out of the city with the rest of the inner circle to head toward the Midlands. Fawkes had a pocket watch, a rare expensive gadget back then, ticking away in his waistcoat, counting down the minutes until dawn when the king and the lords would walk into the chamber right above his head. He had his matches ready. He had some touchwood. He even had a lantern. He was incredibly calm by all accounts, a professional soldier doing a job. He believed he was an instrument of God's justice, cleansing a corrupt kingdom with holy fire, so his conscience probably wasn't bothering him at all as he sat there on an empty barrel. Anyway, Fawkes didn't realise that Suffolk's casual little afternoon visit wasn't the end of it. He thought he'd gotten away with it. He dressed for a quick getaway, wearing his heavy riding boots, his cloak, and a fine hat, planning to light the fuse, which he'd timed to take about 15 minutes, and then immediately jump onto a boat waiting by the river steps to flee across the channel to Flanders before the whole place woke up. He thought he was going to be a hero. He thought the next time he saw London, it would be under a Catholic regency. Midnight came and went. Around midnight, or maybe just a bit after, Sir Thomas Knivet, who was the keeper of Whitehall Palace and a thoroughly no-nonsense justice of the peace, led a squad of heavily armed watchmen down into Fawkes. He had just stepped outside the door, perhaps to check the weather or listen for the horses, when Knivet's men pounced out of the shadows. They grabbed him. They dragged him back inside the cellar. Knivet didn't waste time with polite chat. They searched his pockets immediately. They found 3 matches, some touchwood, the pocket watch Percy had given him. It was the literal smoking gun, or the unlit one at least. Knivet's men started kicking over the bundles of firewood and the heavy iron bars at the back of the room, and there they were, 36 massive wooden casks of gunpowder. Fawkes didn't cower, he didn't cry. He looked Knivet straight in the eye, and allegedly told him that if he had been inside the room when they grabbed him, he would have blown the whole lot up, killing himself, Knivet, and every single watchman in the alleyway just to get the job done. They tied his hands tightly behind his back with leather cords, threw a heavy cloak over his shoulders, and marched him straight into the King's bedchamber at Whitehall. It was about 1 in the morning. King James was dragged out of sleep. Fawkes stood there, completely defiant, telling the king that he was John Johnson from Yorkshire, and that his only regret was that the blast hadn't happened. When a Scottish lord asked him why on earth he had so much powder, Fawkes reportedly smiled and said he wanted to blow you Scottish beggars back to your native mountains. They realised they weren't dealing with an ordinary thief. They had a professional fanatic on their hands, and the state was about to turn its full, terrifying machinery on his bones. Word travelled like wildfire. The moment Fawkes was grabbed, the whole plan on the ground in London completely dissolved into a panicked scramble for the exits. Christopher Wright and Thomas Percy took one look at the guards moving in and immediately hopped on their horses, galloping north toward Warwickshire to meet up with Catesby and the rest of the gang who were waiting at an inn in Dunchurch. They'd set up this massive hunting match as an excuse to gather Catholic gentlemen. But when Catesby arrived and told everyone the London end had completely botched, the assembly evaporated. Most of the guests just packed up their kit and rode home, wanting absolutely nothing to do with high treason. A hardcore group of about 40 men stayed. They spent the next 3 days riding hard across the Midlands, trying to spark a Catholic rebellion by raiding stables for fresh horses, but the local populace just looked at them like they were completely mad. Nobody joined them, not a single person. They were exhausted, soaked to the skin, and covered in filth by the time they reached Holbecker House, on the border of Staffordshire, on the evening of November 7th. It was the home of a Catholic sympathiser named Stephen Littleton. They took their wet gunpowder and spread it out on a platter in front of the great fireplace at Holbecker House to dry it out. A stray spark flew out of the hearth. It landed right in the middle of the powder. A massive explosion ripped through the room, badly burning Catesby, Rookwood and John Wright, and blinding another plotter named Grant. Maybe even God himself was playing a rather cruel joke on them, using their own chosen weapon to blast them before the king's men could even arrive. By the morning of November 8th, the High Sheriff of Worcestershire, Sir Richard Walsh, arrived with a massive posse of over 100 armed men. They surrounded the house. There was no long siege, no parleying, just a brutal, chaotic shootout in the courtyard. Catesby and Percy stood back to back with their swords drawn, completely cornered, and were both reportedly felled by a single lucky musket ball fired by a sniper named John Street. John Wright and his brother Christopher were shot dead right next to them. The rest of the inner circle, Rookwood, Winter and Grant, were badly wounded, dragged out of the smoking ruins of the house and thrown into carts to be hauled back to London in chains. The great Midland rebellion had ended. They took him to the Tower. Not to the nice parts, obviously, but straight down into the cold stone chambers beneath the White Tower, where the river water seeps through the walls and the light never really reaches. The interrogation started in earnest. King James himself had written out a specific set of instructions for the torturers, a letter that still exists, where he told them to start with the gentler tortures, per gradus ad ima, which basically means step by step down to the worst stuff. He was still calling himself John Johnson, keeping his mouth completely shut about who his mates were, which was driving Robert Cecil absolutely up the wall. They wanted names. They wanted to know which Catholic lords were funding this madness. First, they showed him the rack. It was this massive wooden frame with rollers at each end, where they'd tie your wrists to one side and your ankles to the other, and just crank the levers until your joints started popping out of their sockets like dry twigs. Fawkes held out for days. He stayed silent through that. He wouldn't give up Catesby. He wouldn't mention the Wright brothers. By the time November 7th came around, something cracked. It was the sheer, unbearable agony of the torture chamber. He finally admitted his real name, Guido Fawkes. Over the next 2 days, as his body was systematically broken on the rack, he surrendered the rest of the secrets, listing the names of the gentlemen who had sat around the table at the Duck and Drake. The state got what they wanted, and started prepping the big show at Westminster. The trial was a total formality, obviously. Westminster Hall was absolutely packed to the rafters on January 27th, 1606, with people paying ridiculous sums of money just to get a seat and watch the survivors of the plot get completely dismantled by the king's lawyers. Fawkes and the others were brought in on a wooden hurdle, dragged through the freezing slush of the London streets like carcasses being moved to a butcher's shop. They were all found guilty of high treason. The punishment for that wasn't just a simple hanging. It was the full medieval performance, the hanging, drawing and quartering, designed to be as public and as utterly horrifying as humanly possible. It happened over 2 days at the end of January. Fawkes was kept for the second day, January 31st, right outside the building he'd tried to destroy in Old Palace Yard at Westminster. Anyway, Fawkes was the last to go up the ladder. He'd watched his companions, Thomas Winter, Rookwood and Keyes, get hauled up, cut down while they were still breathing, castrated, disemboweled, and their entrails thrown into a boiling cauldron of pitch right before his eyes. He was incredibly weak from the torture, his limbs probably still stiff and half useless from the rack, so the executioner had to help him up the rungs of the ladder to the noose. He managed a final act of defiance, or maybe just a final bit of soldier's luck. When the hangman went to do his business, Fawkes suddenly leaped off the ladder, throwing his full dead weight down with such force that the rope instantly snapped his neck. He died cleanly. He cheated the torturer's knife, at least for the conscious part of it, though they still dragged his corpse over to the block, chopped his head off, and hacked his body into 4 pieces to be dispatched to the 4 corners of the kingdom as a warning to any other papist who fancied messing around with gunpowder. The state got its victory. King James ordered that the 5th of November be a permanent day of Thanksgiving, a tradition that somehow morphed over the centuries into children begging for pennies, giant bonfires in village squares,